I didn't know she was black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn black, and now she wants to be known as black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she black?
If you got something to say it to my face.
Trump's Biden playbook is no longer operative, and he's struggling to find a way to stop Harris's momentum. Next.
This is Washington Week with The Atlantic. Corporate funding provided by Consumer Cellular. Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewan through the Ewan Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. Once again from Washington, Editor-in-Chief of The Atlantic and moderator, Jeffrey Goldberg.
Good evening and welcome to Washington Week. So, first of all, congratulations, America. You survived July. You remember July, right? Joe Biden announced he wouldn't run again. A woman of color became the nominee of a major party. Someone tried and failed to kill Donald Trump. Trump picked J.D. Vance to be his running mate. And meanwhile, Joe Biden, who was written off as a political force, somehow managed one of the most complicated prisoner swaps in history, the result of which is that our Wall Street Journal colleague, Evan Gershkovich, is now free. Joining me tonight to discuss all of this and more, Anne Applebaum is my colleague and a staff writer at The Atlantic. She's also the author of the new bestseller, Autocracy, Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Run the World. Elizabeth Bumiller is the Washington bureau chief for The New York Times. Steve Inskeep is a co-host of NPR's Morning Edition and the author of Differ We Must. And Vivian Salama is a national political reporter at the Wall Street Journal. Welcome all. Vivian, let me start with you. It's a great week at the Wall Street Journal. Tell us how it feels.
I mean, every emotion that you can imagine all at once. Obviously, we are beaming. I saw his parents yesterday. I saw his sister and brother-in-law. And to see after a year and a half of such a weight that was on them lifted, they were smiling from ear to ear. We all were. I mean, cheers, celebrations. Evan is finally free. He never should have been behind bars in Russia in the first place. And that comes with a little bit of frustration for us that just never should have happened. Right. But at this point, we're looking forward. We want him to be well. We're happy that he's free, and we wish him the best.
He's a kind of a stone-cold reporter. He asked Putin in an official document for an interview as he was being taken out of Russia, correct?
Part of the sham protocol as he was leaving was to request clemency directly to Vladimir Putin. And so in that request, he did ask for an interview. And today, the spokesman for the Kremlin responded and said that it is under consideration.
Okay.
So there you go. Mind you, I don't think they would even entertain the idea publicly if they thought he was guilty for a second. But
yeah, they got to get their story straight. Either he's a spy or a journalist.
Obviously. But Evan is free, and that's what matters.
Yeah.
So.
Anne, could you talk a little bit about the geopolitical implications of this? I mean, obviously, all Americans are excited about the release of Evan, the other two Americans, plus a group of Russian dissidents. But, Putin got a reward for essentially kidnapping, among others, an American journalist. I mean, there's a dark cloud here.
There's a dark cloud. I mean, it's in a way there were two things going on. There was the moral imperative to release Evan, to release the Russian dissidents, and on the other hand, there's this moral hazard. We let go a contract killer, a bunch of cyber criminals, and several other spies, and in exchange, we really got hostages. I mean, Gershkovich was not obviously was not a spy, and so there's a fundamental unfairness, and of course, the risk is now that Putin thinks, well, I can capture anybody at any time whenever I need to get somebody back, and that's. And that's the big risk here.
Right. I mean, everybody here has been foreign correspondent and traveled extensively for their jobs. Elizabeth, I have to ask you, as someone who runs a large operation, sending reporters to Russia in the future?
We don't do that. Our Moscow bureau chief is in Berlin.
Right.
Who's determined that it's just not safe for a New York Times bureau chief to be working right now in Moscow, and he's obviously right.
Right.
So no, it's a real problem, and I mean, another positive thing that came out of this is that Biden, it was interesting Biden said it, which was that allies matter. And I think he said that obviously with a nod towards former President Trump, and to point out that he worked very closely with the German chancellor, with the Slovenians, right, as he was about to drop out of the race.
Are you suggesting that Biden was trolling Trump?
I'm suggesting he had a very good day at the end of a really bad month.
Yeah, Steve, let me ask you about that. I mean, it's interesting. Biden obviously had been involved in trying to figure out this very complicated formula for the release of Evan and the others. He seems to still have it in some way.
It's a good thing to remember, anybody who's president, if they're doing their job properly, we don't know 90% of what they're doing, and it turns out we did not know the details of this until it came out. It's also interesting who he brought along for the ceremony of arrival and for other occasions in the last several days. The vice president is with him again and again and again. She made her own statement, which Republicans criticized as word salad. It was a little wordy, but the statement is very clear, actually. It's clear what she meant. She said, this shows the importance of having a president who understands diplomacy and the value of alliances. And so in a way, that was almost a campaign stop for Vice President Harris to be at the center of the action.
You don't often see them at 11:30 at night walking together across a tarmac on a dark, steamy night in Maryland, and I think that was a very striking tableau, the two of them.
By the way, I mean, this is one of the criticism. You very seldom saw Joe Biden at 11:30 at night, period. But he seemed, very energized by. I mean, it's what's done is done. But there was he seemed to be very involved in the guts of this negotiation. I have one question for Anne, who's a professional criminologist. I don't know if that's fair, but I'll just say it anyway.
Close enough.
Yeah, but a little criminology here about the response. There was a feeling that Putin was going to reward Donald Trump when he becomes president. Putin was assuming perhaps that Donald Trump would win, that Trump would be rewarded with this release. And I know there's a lot of speculation, and among people who study Russia and the Byzantine ways of Russian foreign policy, there was this assumption. Does the timing surprise you at all?
So my only guess is that it may even be that Putin is now worried that Trump won't win. And I think he really wanted his contract killer, this guy Krasikov, who was in Germany. He wanted him back.
Tell us what he did.
And he murdered. It was a Chechen dissident, in cold blood, in the middle of the day, in the middle of Berlin. And was caught immediately. Right. And Putin really wants him back because he's one of the top secret police agents.
He had sort of an honor guard at his
arrival. That's right. No, he really wanted him back. It's thought that he has some older connection with him, that he knew him from his KGB days, and he really wanted him back. And it may be that, and the only way, by the way, he got him back was because Biden convinced Scholz to release him. So the German chancellor had to make the decision to release him. And originally the Germans didn't want to do it because, the guy was a murderer. He murdered someone in the middle of the German capital, and they didn't want to let him go. And so I think it was maybe the fear that if Trump won, that Scholz wouldn't release him. So I think a lot of this was about him and this one particular person who he wanted back. And the rest of it is just sort of making other people happy and making the Germans. There were a bunch of Germans who were released too. Right.
It's fascinating because we come back to this point about allies. I think when Vice President Harris said that, I think that was top of mind. The idea that what Joe Biden did was work the phones intensely with other foreign leaders in a way that those of us who've covered the first Trump administration would find unlikely.
Well, he did call Ukraine, remember. Just keep in mind.
There was a perfect phone call. I think that was the so-called perfect phone call. Let's move to the behavior of another autocracy. I'm going to stay on the theme because of Anne's book. Iran is threatening very openly to seek vengeance on Israel. There's this expectation that some large-scale action is going to happen sometime soon. The Defense Department just announced that America moving more assets to the region, defensive shields over Israel, et cetera. I'm curious to know if you all think that this is the moment when things spin even more out of control in the Middle East? I mean, Steve, you've been to Iran many times.
A number of times. At a minimum, things get closer to spinning out of control. I have a memory of being actually at an earlier version of this table months ago, and we discussed this. We discussed how it was not in Iran's interest, as Iran saw it, to go into a wider war, and it seemed they would avoid it as long as they could. Nevertheless, they have been struck in this way. Israel killed Ismail Haniyeh, who we should remember was the political leader of Hamas, widely regarded as a terrorist group, but they killed him in Tehran at a particularly embarrassing moment.
To make a point.
To make a point, perhaps, but in any case, to kill him, and leaving Iran with no choice, really, but to respond in some way.
Well, there's always a choice.
From the Iranian point of view. Right. And so the question is, if Iran still sees it in their interest not to engage in a much wider war with Israel, can they find some way to respond, as they have in some other recent incidents, that fall just a little bit short of an utter conflict?
That's the expectation right now of national security officials in the United States. But nonetheless, the Pentagon is moving combat aircraft and warships into the region in preparation to perhaps do what happened, but maybe more so than happened in April.
Yeah, this is round two of the missile.
When there were all these drones and the U.S. and the Britain and other allies shot them down.
Jordan, Saudi Arabia, all were involved.
But it's important to also remember that this comes at a moment where the U.S. has been trying to broker a ceasefire agreement. Yeah. Haniyeh was in a large way involved in those talks, as is Netanyahu and just Hamas in general. And to have this happen at this moment brings us further away potentially from achieving that goal, which Biden would love to see, which is to achieve that.
I want to come back to Ann in a second, but Vivian, stay on that point because it's interesting. You know, there's a lot of criticism in Israel or in national security circles in Israel that there's no love lost here. There's no sympathy for Ismail Haniyeh, who's responsible for murders of a lot of Israelis. But there is a belief among Netanyahu's many critics that he is trying to, for personal and political reasons, extend the war, and he's not paying attention to the hostages. There's more than 100 Israelis still being held hostage in Hamas. Do you have any insight into the salience of this kind of idea that Netanyahu did this very much on purpose in order to slow this down and get the confrontation with Iran that may be coming?
I certainly can't read Netanyahu's mind, but I can tell you that numerous U.S. officials who I've spoken to have speculated that that is his intention. Obviously, he has a lot of political battles at home that prolonging any kind of conflict might put off kind of him ultimately having to face the music. But at the same time, you have this tit for tat that continues with Iran and Lebanon and Israel. And whether or not it escalates into a full-blown war, a lot of these parties don't necessarily want it to. But ultimately, what it does do is delay a ceasefire.
Biden himself said at Andrews, at Joint Base Andrews last night when the hostages were coming back, he was asked by the pool of reporters, how does this affect the negotiations? This assassination. He goes, it doesn't help, and it was like, it was a quick sentence full of meaning. He's been through it a lot.
Right.
If I can add one other little piece of the story that's fairly new, is there is beginning to be evidence that the Russians are beginning to help the Iranians with new kinds of weapons. You know, these Iranian drones that are going to Russia are being, to use in the war in Ukraine, are being remade and remodeled and possibly sent back to Iran. So it could be that if the Iranians are bolder than they used to be, it could be because they have more allies than they used to.
What a convenient way for me to introduce the main topic of this book, Autocracy Inc. The theory of which is that you are looking at a tacit alliance of China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, for starters. Talk about the risk here that if the U.S., let's say, in the coming hours, days, has to come in the defense of Israel and maybe Jordan as well if Iran is firing rockets and does something kinetic, as they say, against Iran. Does that bring the U.S. closer into an open confrontation even with Russia or other elements of this autocratic alliance?
It's a network. It's not an alliance.
Not an alliance.
It's a
Explain
network.
the difference.
They don't have anything in common ideologically. So this is theocratic Iran and communist China and nationalist Russia, and they don't have a special room where they meet and make decisions. They just cooperate when it's in their interests at particular moments. And right now, Russia is very interested in confronting the U.S. and challenging the U.S. wherever it can because of the war in Ukraine.
So you say it's not an alliance, but it sounds like Russia would benefit from having Iran act as a proxy.
Yes, of course.
Okay, so but you're saying that the coordination is looser than we think.
They didn't sign a treaty somewhere where it says, like the NATO treaty, I will help you in case of X. But are they interested in the U.S. being dragged into a war in the Middle East? Yes, they are.
Right. Anything to drag America into any bad situation.
Anything that will keep them away from helping Ukrainians.
And one more question for you before we turn to domestic politics. On this question of the next hours, Lloyd Austin very publicly is moving American assets closer to where a fight could take place. Is Iran deterrable? I mean, is this the sort of action that would cause a rational or semi-rational autocratic regime to say, you know what? Biden seems upset. Maybe I'm not going to go do the thing I'm going to do.
I mean, I can't read their minds either, but I mean, yeah, they.
I wish you all could read minds.
I know, I can too.
Yeah, I can read Netanyahu's mind.
Yeah. Make a more exciting show, right? We can all just mind read.
No. I mean, but yeah, I mean, the idea in all these cases is to raise the cost. Raise the cost for them, make them think about it harder. That's what we didn't do, by the way, in 2022, in the run-up to the war in Ukraine. We didn't. The Ukrainians weren't sufficiently armed.
Right.
And I mean, I think that was a lesson that in each of these cases.
That was also a problem of the Ukrainians not believing American warnings that Russia was going to.
Also.
But right, the pathway was open, I guess. Let's turn to, and we can come back to this, but let's turn to the domestic scene for a minute. We're all waiting to find out who Kamala Harris picks as vice president. The solidifying conventional wisdom in our city is that it's Josh Shapiro's to lose, the governor of Pennsylvania. Talk for a minute about his positives and negatives on this ticket. Start with
Well,
Elizabeth.
his positives are he's the governor of Pennsylvania, and she has to win Pennsylvania.
There's no way for Kamala Harris to win the presidency without Pennsylvania?
That
in a plausible way?
Well, no, that's the yes. He's a very popular Democratic governor, and he is well-spoken. He's good on the stump. He's smart. On the other hand, I'm just going to repeat what the former president said today, that, well, he's Jewish, and that means that she...
Former president meaning Donald Trump,
yes.
not Barack Obama or
no, right.
Bush. Okay, just to be clear.
He just put it right out there, just like he always does, and there is some concern that, this will be a problem in Michigan with the Muslim groups who are... Donald Trump said it, the Palestinians who support Kamala Harris. I mean, he went so far as to, again, playing this divisive strategy.
So playing philo-Semitic, but actually sort of baiting anti-Semites is what Trump's move was?
I would say so, yes.
Okay.
And so that's...
I mean, how serious is that as a challenge compared to the positives that he brings?
They're very enthusiastic about him so far, and they see his background politically and otherwise as something that could really help and bolster Kamala Harris's appeal to voters right now. Obviously, the Republicans, as Elizabeth was saying, have been looking for ways to kind of find division and set them apart and kind of show voters why this candidacy couldn't work, this ticket couldn't work. But right now, there's a lot of enthusiasm. There are a number of other potential candidates, but it seems that Governor Shapiro so far is in the lead, and he's very popular.
Steve, the assiduous reporter that you are, you spend a lot of time talking to voters in Pennsylvania.
I did.
Give us a sense of why Shapiro is popular in his state, much more popular than Joe Biden.
Well, why he's popular, he's taken what are seen as more moderate positions or more realistic positions that fit with voters in Pennsylvania. People in Pennsylvania are worried about security. Shapiro had a different view of protests and of law enforcement than perhaps some other Democrats have had in the last couple of years, and people have responded to that. I think of one voter I spoke with in Pennsylvania in particular, and she said genuinely undecided, registered Republican, is generally against abortion, nevertheless thinks Republicans are too extreme on abortion, would like to vote for a Democrat. she said she wasn't sure she could vote for a woman for president, but then went on to say, this registered Republican, that Shapiro on the ticket would help. There are Republicans that you can run into in Pennsylvania who like this Democrat, and that is such an extraordinarily rare thing to encounter anybody going across party
Can I
lines.
ask you a question why she couldn't vote for a woman for president?
She said things that I've heard from other people, and this is out in America. I am reporting to you what I hear from some
I don't doubt it. I don't
You're
doubt it.
outnumbered.
Her concern
We don't shoot the
is-
messenger here on PBS.
Her concern is like that personal nature of being in the room with all these men. Will they respect her? Will they treat her as an equal? My first thought is if you have the power, they're going to be forced to treat you as an equal. But this voter and other people that I've talked with wonder how those interpersonal relations are going to
Is she
work.
familiar with the life and work of Nancy Pelosi?
I could have brought it up. I could have brought it up.
Yeah. No, it's
There were
interesting.
people who said that about Barack Obama. You know, would
Yes.
a black leader be respected by other people around the world? I heard people say that at the time.
Steve, you brought up abortion as an issue, and let's talk about J.D. Vance for a minute. He's had an interesting mixed week as a candidate. People are finding different things that he said over the years that don't make him popular. Let me just be diplomatic
He was
about.
talkative on podcasts.
He made the
Far-right
mistake of going on podcasts and talking a lot. There's one podcast that just came out, 2021. He was asked, should a woman be forced to carry a child to term after she's been the victim of incest or rape? And he answered, look, my view on this has been very clear, and I think the question betrays a certain presumption that's wrong. It's not whether a woman should be forced to bring a child to term. It's whether a child should be allowed to live, even though the circumstances of that child's birth are somehow inconvenient or a problem to the society. So here he's arguing against, seemingly, the incest or rape exception. I've got to imagine that this kind of view is not making people happy at Trump headquarters.
No, of course not. This is not, I don't know. This was not a great pick, and it sounds like the former president Donald Trump thinks that himself. You notice when he was speaking to the NABJ convention, he went so far as to say, well, it doesn't matter who's on the ticket as vice president. It doesn't matter. So that is what he now thinks of his vice presidential pick. That doesn't matter. It's all about me. No, he's had a terrible, terrible rollout.
Right.
Cat ladies, we can go on and on.
There's also another issue that J.D. Vance was still chosen when Biden was in the race,
Right.
leading the
He was
ticket.
chosen in a Biden environment.
In a Biden environment where also coupled with the fact that Trump believes that his vice presidential candidate really doesn't matter, Biden himself was uncomfortable with the discussion of abortion, the debate of abortion. His Catholic upbringing made it a very uncomfortable subject for him to tackle. Now Kamala Harris is leading the ticket, and it's a completely different race,
Right.
particularly on this issue.
In the last couple of minutes, I want to go to Ann with something that Donald Trump said at the NABJ convention. It was not the thing that got the most attention, but it had to do with January 6th. When he was asked whether he would pardon January 6th rioters, he said this.
My question is on those rioters who assaulted officers.
You have to
would
ask,
you pardon
what's
those
going to
people?
happen? Oh, absolutely, I would.
You
If
would
they're
pardon
innocent,
those-
If they're innocent, I would pardon them.
They've been
And
convicted.
by the way, the Supreme Court well, they were convicted by a very tough system.
So, Ann, they were convicted because there's videos of them doing crimes. Let's just park that aside. I'm curious, interpreting what he said through the prism of what you understand about the autocratic mentality. What are you getting from that appearance?
He's getting people used to the idea that courts are politicized and can be manipulated, and that's okay. That's normal. That rule of law is malleable, and he's getting people used to the idea that there could be something different, ruled by law, which is what happens in Russia and China and North Korea, which means that the leader decides what the law is. And so I proclaim them innocent, and so they are. And he is changing the way people talk.
And last question on this. Do the Democrats benefit from talking about his lack of fealty to democratic norms, or is that not a main issue in the next 3 months?
I think they do, as long as they're also talking about the future and what will change and what will happen. It's not, they can't run a campaign that's just about the past.
Right. And what would change in terms of January 6th? Do you think the American people will accept the pardoning of these January 6 rioters?
Some people will, and some people will find it profoundly offensive, and that it will be it would be an unbelievably divisive issue, of course.
Well, unfortunately, we need to leave it there for now.
Cheerful note to end. Well,
Cheerful note, yeah. I was trying to go up note, but here we are. But I want to thank our panelists for sharing their views and their reporting, and to our viewers at home, I want to thank you for joining us. And a reminder to add Anne's book, Autocracy, Inc., to your summer reading list. Talk about cheery books. And if by remote chance you haven't already read Steve's book, Differ We Must, it's not too late. It's still available. I'm Jeffrey Goldberg. Good night from Washington.
Corporate funding for Washington Week with The Atlantic is provided by
Consumer Cellular. This is Sam. How may I help you? This is a pocket dial. Well, somebody's pocket. Thought I'd let you know that with Consumer Cellular, you get nationwide coverage with no contract. That's kind of our thing. Have a nice day.
Additional funding is provided by Koo and Patricia Ewan through the Ewan Foundation, committed to bridging cultural differences in our communities. Sandra and Carl DeLay Magnuson, Rose Herschel and Andy Shreves, Robert and Susan Rosenbaum, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.